the Bible, as it was known in Israel when the Old Testament was written, was in Hebrew. It was in Hebrew, and when the Jews came back to the land of Israel after the Babylonian captivity, they had taken on a particular dialect of Aramaic that was different from what they used to speak. And so they had to have it translated to them. I believe it was Nehemiah that translated it into that dialect of Aramaic, and that is believed to be what the Targums came from. The Targums are a sort of abbreviated, paraphrased version of certain Old Testament chapters of Scripture, and it was more of an oral tradition among the Jews in ancient Israel to speak these abbreviated versions of Scripture called Targums. And the Jews of the diaspora in the Greek-speaking world, apart from the land of Israel, came to need a Greek version of Scripture. And so the Septuagint came about because the story goes Ptolemy had 72 Jewish translators come from the land of Israel to Alexandria, Egypt, and translated. They, as a collaborative effort, they translated the Old Testament, the Jewish Bible, into Greek, and they call it the Septuagint. Now, the Septuagint was the text, the Bible text embraced by the early Christians, the Greek-speaking Christians. They viewed it as their Bible, much in the same way that the English-speaking diehard KJV fans say that KJV is the final authority on Scripture. A lot of the early Christians said the same thing about the Septuagint. They didn't like the Hebrew Old Testament because there were certain things that the Septuagint said that the Hebrew Old Testament did not necessarily say. One is the verse in Isaiah where it talks about how a virgin will give birth to a son. Well, in the Hebrew, it doesn't say virgin. It says a maiden. The word is alma, and it literally means a young woman, young lady, maiden, a girl, and not necessarily virgin. Well, the early Christians didn't like hearing a version of it that didn't refer to the virgin birth, and so they embraced more wholeheartedly the Septuagint. And pretty much the same thing happened when Jerome was commissioned to translate the Bible into Latin. He used a good Greek source text, and also he went back to the Hebrew and he showed where the Hebrew and the Greek Old Testaments differed, and St. Augustine, who knew Jerome, kind of rebuked him because he felt that the only Christian scripture should be the Septuagint. And so there was that sort of zeal for the Greek text, which was actually a translation of the original Hebrew. And eventually the Roman Catholic Church came to view the Latin Vulgate, which was Jerome's Latin translation, as authoritative. In the late Renaissance times, well, you could say in the early Reformation times, actually, Erasmus, who was a Roman Catholic humanist, he did a more polished Latin edition of the Bible, and also published a Greek version based on manuscripts available to him. And he noticed that there were parts that were in the Latin version that were not in the Greek version. One of those parts was in the part in First John where it's talking about, these three agree. I can't remember exactly how it goes, but there's a direct reference to the Trinity there in this verse that's found in the Latin, but he could not find that verse in any of the Greek manuscripts that he had, which were from the 12th century. And when he did his translation, he did not put that in his translation. And he received a lot of pressure from other corners, and he said that he would put it in there if they could produce a text that had the verse in it, the Greek that had the verse in it. He would he would do it. And so they fabricated a text, and it ended up in the King James version of the Bible, because that Erasmus's Greek publication of the New Testament is the one that William Tyndale used to translate the Greek New Testament into English. And William Tyndale's rendition is the base of the King James version of the Bible. 80% of the New Testament is William Tyndale's translation, and it was based on Erasmus's Greek New Testament publication. And the source texts for Erasmus's publication are Byzantine texts that are from the 12th century, the late medieval period. And since that time, there have been a lot of earlier and more reliable manuscripts that have been discovered, particularly in the 1800s and 1900s. The group of manuscripts that are seen as most authoritative and pure, more true to the original Greek, is the Alexandrian text type. And this is the earliest dating group of manuscripts from the 2nd to 4th centuries. And they don't contain a lot of the scribal errors and fabrications that the later manuscripts have, but they tend to be shorter in length. They also have a more difficult reading, and this is seen as evidence that they haven't been touched up with a more polished flow of language like the other manuscripts. What a lot of scholars have been doing, or translators have been doing for over a century now, is comparing these earlier manuscripts very closely with each other to see all the points of agreement and variation in order to, in a forensic way, piece together a critical text based on all the comparisons that seems to most accurately portray what the original might have looked like. They show variant readings too, so that the translator can make a judgment call if necessary on a particular verse. The most highly regarded critical texts are the Nestle Aland and the United Bible Society's critical editions. It's from these two texts that almost all modern translations of the Bible are derived. The Textus Receptus, which is the version that the King James Bible is translated from, that includes the texts used by Erasmus, it is now looked at by most scholars as a more erroneous and less authoritative text, and for that reason it's hardly ever used for translations nowadays. One exception being the New King James Version that actually uses the received text, the Textus Receptus.